Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would now invite my speakers to join me on stage. Kurt, Martin, Michael, Harvey and Lauren, please be seated. I will introduce, similar to Stephen's modus operandi, I will introduce each one in due time and then you can save your applause until the very end. Thank you very much indeed. So, my distinguished speakers, I would first of all like to welcome Mr. Kurt van den Berge, who is Director General of DG Clima in the European Commission since January 16th, 2023. Prior to that, he was Green Deal and Health Advisor and a member of the Cabinet of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen when she first took office on December 1st, 2019. And it should be mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, that many moons ago, from February 2010 until June 2013, this gentleman sat beside me, served as head of cabinet to the then Environment Commissioner, the forum's chairman, Mr. Janusz Potocznik. And prior to that, he was deputy head of cabinet and then head of cabinet when Janusz, of course, was in charge of the research and innovation portfolio in the previous administration. So I will just show you the degrees of connectivity here today at the forum. Next up, we have Martin Stuktai. I asked him how to pronounce his surname and he said it's the tie that I'm not wearing today. So fair enough, Martin. I got that brief. And Martin is the founder of the Land Banking Group, a company dedicated to stop and reverse nature loss. Martin is also a professor of resource strategy and management at the University of Innsbruck School of Management. And I should mention that the Land Banking Group is a supporting partner of this forum. A warm welcome to Mr. Michael Brückner, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to last night at the speaker's dinner, who is the Chief Executive Officer and a member of the Board of Directors of Munich Re Investment Partners. Here he leads Munich Re Group's specialist asset management firm, which focuses on delivering systemic climate-native investment solutions for institutional asset owners, which was all new to me, Michael, when we discussed that over dinner. So thank you for educating me in this whole area. I hope you found AgriFacts and the work that I do as inspirational. Next up, we have Harvey Locke, again from what can only be described as the idyllic Banff in Western Canada, who he was telling us about last night, which he was describing in great detail. Harvey Locke, who is the president of the Harvey Locke Conservation Inc., and is a vice chair for Nature Positive at the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. And Harvey brings with him about 40 years of experience and is at the forefront of some of the biggest ideas in global conservation, such as Nature Needs Half and the Nature Positive Global Goal. And we look forward to hearing more about that, Harvey, in a moment. And last but by no means least, I would like to welcome Lauren Phillips, who is Director in charge of Partnership and UN Collaboration at the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, since January of this year, again, newish to the job. Lauren previously served as Deputy Director for Rural Transformation and Gender Equality at the Rome-based agency from November 2021. And I understand, Lauren, that there is a job vacancy going as the Director General of your organization, which we are following very closely here in Brussels. So feel free to share some of your insights with me over a coffee later on. But ladies and gentlemen, please give my distinguished speakers a warm round of applause. Now, we have a lot to get through, and we're going to stick with maybe 55 minutes. We've gone a little bit over schedule, but we will stick with 55 minutes because I think this is an important panel discussion to have, considering the sort of progression of the discussion so far. So just to talk you through the running order, Mr. Kurt van den Berge, Director General of DG Clima, will first deliver his keynote address. Once that is over, Kurt, you return to the hot seat, and we will continue the discussion. And each one of the speakers then will deliver an impulse statement of about 4 minutes. There's a countdown clock in front of you. And that will stimulate a broader discussion among the panelists and with the audience, both here in the square and online. So without further ado, Kurt, take it away. The podium is all yours. We look forward to hearing your keynote address on this important topic from DG Clima's point of view. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you to the organizers of the forum for inviting a climate policymaker to this very full forum I see here today. The world is getting crazy, and it looks as if everything is changing in the world today, but one thing that is not changing is climate change. It continues unabated, and its impacts are increasingly felt across society, particularly in the agri-food system and in forestry. Agriculture, we know, is one of the EU's most climate-exposed sectors, with rising risks for food production, farmers' livelihoods, and the EU security and stability. According to the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, and yes, we continue to take science very seriously in Europe, weather-related crop losses in Europe are expected to increase from about 17.5 billion currently to 25, 29 billion in 2050 on an average basis. And they could reach up to 51 to 57 billion per year in an individual years. Now, these numbers, ladies and gentlemen, however staggering they are rather abstract when they are told in a panel session like we have here today at the forum in Brussels. But they are very real for farmers who do not deny at all the impact of climate change, even if sometimes they would wish to conveniently ignore the contribution of agriculture to climate change. At the same time, there are many farmers interested in developing solutions for a more climate resilient agriculture that also reduces emissions. So it's no wonder that this is reflected in the new proposals for agriculture in the next multi-annual budget of the European Union, which rightly positions climate change as a systemic risk for agriculture. Above all, it introduces tools for risk and crisis management, including an expanded agriculture reserve, a safety net, and mechanisms to support farmers during climate crisis. Now, beyond the extreme weather events, also significant are the indirect long-term costs from slow onset climate change. According to the European Environment Agency, soil degradation amplified by climate change causes 40 to 73 billion damage to the EU soils per year. And we've seen a recent research by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research indicating that climate change could wipe out up to half of today's land suitable for grazing cattle, sheep, and goats by the end of this century. Most of these impacts will fall on Africa, but also in Europe. This silent, invisible, but worrying evolution is also clear when you consider the carbon sink capacity of our land in the European Union. Our land sector has lost 1/3 of its carbon sink capacity over the last 10 years, and our member states have real difficulties in meeting their national targets under the land use change, and forestry regulation. That should be a real worry, especially at a time when the Middle East events also expose our costly dependence on imported fossil fuels, and we are looking at the bioeconomy as a source of renewable biomass for energy and materials, replacing petroleum-based products in a circular, lower carbon system. In today's geopolitical complex landscape, it is more important than ever, we believe, that we strengthen the resilience of Europe's value chains and value chain resilience, and ensure the security of supply within the bioeconomy, not only to deliver on our climate and environmental ambition, but maybe even more so to ensure Europe's economic stability. As policy entrepreneurs at the European Commission, in particular DG Clima, we see it as your objective to create enabling conditions that will empower land managers and all value chain actors to adapt to the changing climate and to succeed in the transition to a climate neutral economy. And there we see carbon farming as a catalyst, a driver for this transition. Carbon farming refers to agriculture and forestry practices that increase carbon storage in soils and biomass and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from land use. It can, and we believe it shall, play an increasing role in the EU's economy in the next decades, in view of the need to balance greenhouse gas emissions and removals, and equally enable the transition towards more regenerative agri-food value chains, supporting farmers' resilience and competitiveness with additional complementary income. And that's why I believe I was invited to participate in the panel on financing. We are putting in place the main elements for a well-functioning and credible voluntary carbon farming market in Europe. And creating such a market at least needs three things. First, credible certification. The Carbon Removals and Carbon Farming Regulation, the CRCF, an acronym which I invite you to remember because it will be talked about a lot in the future. The CRCF, which entered into force in 2024, underpins any form of result-based incentives for farmers and foresters. It does not just certify the activity, it certifies that a carbon removal or storage outcome meets strict EU criteria in terms of quantification, additionality, long-term storage, durable storage, but also sustainability in the form of positive benefits for biodiversity. We have already put in place the rules for a credible certification process, and we will soon launch the process to recognize certification schemes. We are right now finalizing the carbon farming methodologies for agriculture and agroforestry on mineral soils, afforestation, and re-wetting and restoration of peatlands. And we're also addressing this year, as requested by the European Parliament and the Council, whether to expand the scope of carbon farming to emission reductions from livestock farming. This year and next, we can start implementing this system on the ground, and we call on land managers, project developers, providers of innovative monitoring, reporting, and verification solutions, as well as certification schemes, to engage and help make the CRCF a success story for the whole EU bioeconomy. Second requirement, accessible and affordable monitoring, reporting, and verification for land. There is indeed an opportunity and a necessity to improve MRV systems for land. We are currently working with the Joint Research Centre and the European Environment Agency to facilitate the tracking of emission reductions and carbon removals in national and corporate greenhouse gas inventories and develop comprehensive and harmonized MRV for land. This is crucial, of course, to measure progress, avoid double counting, ensure transparency and credible corporate sustainability reporting, as well as supporting policy and markets and achieve credible climate targets. We are determined, ladies and gentlemen, to make it as simple as possible for farmers and foresters to participate in the voluntary carbon farming market. And we recently announced, as part of our bioeconomy strategy, that we will establish an EU carbon farming database of models, emission factors, remote sensing products, and benchmarking datasets that will reduce monitoring and administrative costs. And we are cooperating very closely with our colleagues in DG Agriculture, who are developing the On-Farm Sustainability Compass initiative. And third, certainly not least, a strong and more predictable demand. A market consists of supply and demand, and a supply of carbon farming credits at scale will of course only materialize if there are buyers willing to pay a sufficient price. Some enterprises are already engaging in purchasing carbon farming credits. We know of some national and pilot schemes for carbon farming credits in EU countries, but most of these are still early stage and mostly subsidy-based. And that's why we announced in our recent bioeconomy strategy that the Commission will establish an EU buyers club in order to create predictable demand for result-based schemes and to stimulate private investment. Such buyers club will be designed as a voluntary initiative to pull demand from private companies that are interested to purchase certified carbon removal credits, including carbon farming credits. And the creation of such a EU Buyers Club was a central and mobilizing team at our third carbon farming summit in Padua last month, and I was very encouraged, I must say, by the high interest in these three pillars of a carbon farming market. There are, of course, a number of questions to crack, such as how can the Commission support the EU Buyers Club to make it work most efficiently, and what role could public funding play to help create a self-sustaining market. We will soon launch a research survey to inform a study on the design of this Buyers Club, and we will discuss these questions with our stakeholders during the CRCF days in Brussels on the 20th and 21st of May. I'm confident, ladies and gentlemen, that we can soon test a first prototype of the Buyers Club, and with time, this will evolve into an important tool to enable member states to achieve their climate targets, but also, and above all, support farmers in the transition to more resilient agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Kurt. I think you covered some key aspects there, bringing it right up to speed in terms of carbon farming and certainly the bioeconomy strategy as well. That's relatively new. We'll come back to you on some of those points, and perhaps the speakers might like to delve into some of the areas that, that Kurt raised in terms of the carbon farming credits and that idea of maybe perhaps the public support and the private support, the private investment that we were discussing yesterday evening over dinner. But I turn to you now, Martin. You're obviously a founder of the Land Banking Group. You're coming from a different perspective. The topic of the day is financing and accelerating that transition on the ground. On the basis of what Kurt has said, on the basis of your own experience, we look forward to hearing from you. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. I can't listen to Kurt van den Berg without wanting to react to that. And perhaps I'm not wearing my hat as a technology entrepreneur for whom you might have invited me, but rather the resource economist. Isn't it interesting listening to you how we are wrestling to solve this problem of how to make a land use decision on a square meter? It's still one of the unresolved economic problems of our time. The value of land could be defined by the historic agricultural productive capacity, and that's what we very much do. And that very much gives us a backward view on its value. Or it could be governed by the total productive capacity into the future, so which gives us a forward view. And I think it's the latter that scientists or economists or political scholars such as Michael Wertz this morning sort of tell us that that is in fact the better choice. Scientists are telling us that first of all that the future is not the past because even the most sort of pessimistic IPCC scenarios assume that we are getting the land use thing right, which is the sum of millions of daily land use decisions. And they're also telling us, of course, that our well-being is predominantly the function of all these ecosystem services that we are secretly building into our production function. The economists, they are telling us, look, again, the future might not be the past because on the one hand, the costs are coming up. We see flatlining yields, and we see all these mounting risks that currently are all invisible and not fully priced in. And that is happening in capital markets that are increasingly nervous about all these unpriced systemic risks that sit in our portfolios, that sit in our value chains. Some people start talking about the Minsky moment of nature, where all of a sudden you have a sudden correction of all these valuations because nature starts turning into liability. And then, of course, politicians tell us that increasingly we need to look at nature, soil health as part of our security architecture, which we haven't done in the past. So in all of that, of course, that solution that we care so much about, so the Rubik Cube version of agriculture, Janez, as you said yesterday, where you're not just trying to optimize one piece, but all pieces at the time, is of course the economically superior solution. We work with the Land Banking Group Group in Brazil, it's absolutely clear that we'll be using 30% of our soy harvest in the southeastern part of the Amazon with current climate scenarios. And through that, we lose $600 of yield per hectare per year. And the only way to stop that is to reinvest into soil health, into keeping the mosaic forest. And that is cheaper than what you would be losing. So there's almost an arbitrage opportunity of $400 or $500 sitting on every hectare, which we're currently not picking up. And we are not picking it up because this nature is invisible to us. And that's sort of where Penn can wear my technologist hat. We think for the first time we have an opportunity to change that because we are able now to build digital representations of nature and soil health. We are able to build financial and economic representations and legal representations. So the digital ones is basically to give every pixel of the planet an ecological passport with regard to the stocks of biodiversity, water holding capacity, soil microbiomes, above, below the ground carbon, habitat diversity, and put that on ledgers. Then the financial one is we are increasingly able now to relate every unit of nature maintained or nature improved and give it and estimate what kind of economic value it creates for us. Nature risk pricing models is a term here that we use a lot. And then finally, the legal representation, it's increasingly possible to create a higher quality of contractual relationship between those who are delivering these better outcomes and those who need it, which in the end is all of us. So that is very much also what we are trying to build as a company. And we thought rather than just a couple of companies using this in the way these natural capital systems and the way we are using SAP as well for our value chain, wouldn't we like to live in a world where these digital and financial infrastructures are available to everyone? And we are now have been asked to build the first nature cadastre. Just imagine to live in a world where there's reference database that allows you to see how much nature is being built on every plot of land. Wouldn't that make it so much easier for Mr. Hansen sort of to move towards a world where the next CAP actually is about agri-environmental outcomes where you can measure them? Wouldn't it allow us to redefine nature protection entirely, where we don't need sort of the courageous efforts of NABU fighting plot by plot, where we can agree almost on an essential infrastructure plan for all of Europe, where we say this is just another infrastructure category that we need in the same way we have a transcontinental network for energy or for transport, we have one for nature, and we refinance it because we know the outcomes in the way we are financing other infrastructure categories. And wouldn't it make it even for the central banks, the prudential regulators, so much easier to do what they are meant to do to live up to their financial and monetary stability mandate by making sure we know these risks and we can start invest against them.
Okay.
So there
I'm
is
just gonna
something
cut
called
across,
the
if you don't
nature
mind,
cadastre, which will get online this year. And
Okay.
this requires the entire community sort of to engage with that new technological opportunity.
Okay, thank you for that, Martin. And certainly the whole area of risk, I think that's the perfect segue now for your colleague Michael Bruckner from Munich Reinvestment Partners, that idea of climate being built in and difficult to price there. So perhaps you might take it away now from your point of view, from the Munich Reinvestment Partners, and perhaps just the work that you do in financing that transition on the ground and some of the obstacles that you've hit along the way, picking up on some of the points perhaps that, that both Martin and Kurt have raised.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I guess one very important point Martin just mentioned, and this is, I think, like the peak interest for institutional investors is price. And I think this is where kind of, let me a bit delve into this, because this is essentially like my stance about the couple of minutes I want to share with you. Is that like today, with the transition we're currently seeing, we definitely have to reassess the present day financial reality when we're looking at assets. The environment has changed in our way that climate physical nature risks are like not a scenario for 2050 or wherever. It's something which affects yields, supply chains, infrastructure, insurance costs, and asset valuations like already today. And yet still, in a lot of cases in financial markets, these risks are treated as idiosyncratic or company-specific, regional, one-off events. As a result, many of these risks remain externalities. But as we also heard from Kurt earlier, more and more of these risks are even regarded by policymakers now as systemic, and this is what they are. Like flood risk, heat stress, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and all of this is like affecting the real economy outcomes of today, but still, again, only partially priced and reflected in asset valuations, cash flow forecasts, and capital costs. And as a result, if you do not price these things, they are sitting with balance sheets, they are not made to hold it. To attract more of capital for the transition, it's important that obviously investments follows yields. It follows returns, or it follows advice when you see that you could otherwise incur losses. But it follows a given level of risk if the return is made sure. It doesn't follow a narrative. So therefore, things got to be comparable, measurable, and you have to build portfolios at scale. Like climate risks are essential, like to determine then where capital is likely to be destroyed because we simply overestimated the resilience of a certain area, region, or asset, or in the contrarian scenario where you see markets being underappreciating resilience and overappreciating the robustness of certain business models. So therefore, for me, that is a journey. Essentially, we got to integrate these climate risks, like any other financial risks, into the equation of the regular financial decision making. And here it can like translate as a source of return. It can drive investment opportunities if you're getting to assess these risks right. At the same time, and we got to be honest here, we're talking private capital. Private capital will not be immediately available for like every climate or nature positive outcome which we will be seeing. Initiatives like such as Kurt was presenting are therefore crucial that we kind of, have the full toolbox available to further the transition. However, the biggest lever is the integration of climate, physical, nature risk in investment decision making, in the mainstream investment decision making of traditional finance. Because then it's something which can be priced, which can be capital charged, and which can be allocated against. To get there, obviously, it would be helpful if further policy support would be available to clearly define rules around who's carrying actual climate risk, who absorbs policy risks, and what type of risk exactly can be transferred through financial markets. With that, and with like more solid common ground, and with more corporate disclosure standards and data collection available, and also standardization with regard on how we model all these risks, I think that will be a great support to exactly get there. Because when climate and nature is priced, addressing those risks stops being a preference, then this is becoming a necessity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. And you're picking up, I think, from some of the points raised this morning about big data, standardization, sort of creating that baseline that we talked about perhaps in the first session when it comes to soil health, for example. But also, I suppose, it's all about the money as well, right? It's all about return on your investment and how do you make those nature-based investment opportunities attractive. So perhaps we'll come back to some of those points that you raised, you three gentlemen, but we will continue on because we've got two other panelists at the end. Harvey, you're coming from a completely different perspective in the sense that you've worked, I suppose, most of your career as a conservationist. You're also a prolific writer, you're a photographer, you're also a great thinker and on this whole topic. Perhaps you'll pick up on some of the points that your fellow panelists have raised, but also maybe bring it back to what's happening on the ground. What are your fears? What are your aspirations? And how do you think this whole debate will progress, given, I suppose, the budgetary impacts and the budgetary constraints that we find ourselves in?
Thank you. I really liked the theme earlier about connecting dots. And I think when we talk about connecting dots, we need to reconceive how to connect the dots. So one dot, risk. If you want to motivate private finance, you either generate reward or you reduce risk. Really simple. Public finances are restricted. So we know that. The reasons for that were given. We have rising security concerns. We have a declining nature situation, and we have whole bread baskets, major agricultural producing regions that are at risk. So in the past, we've had ways of thinking about that, but what if we reconceive it? And I'll give you an example of the Amazon and the great breadbasket of Latin America, which is the Rio de la Plata Basin, where I think it's number 5 and 6, Argentina and Brazil, are among the greatest crop producers in the world. We were talking about that earlier. Well, and then the Amazon rainforest disappearing, we all know that's a problem. They're actually really connected. All these things are connected, and here's how they're connected. The Amazon rainforest gets rain from the ocean like we're all taught in school. It comes up, evaporates, falls down, goes in the river and back to the ocean. But then a remarkable thing happens. The forest itself begins to generate rain. And that happens, it's called a flying river. Only people from Brazil are broadly aware of this, but it's a fascinating phenomenon. The forest pumps rain into the sky until you get to the Andes Mountains, when something in the order of 70% of the rain that falls was generated by the forest. Now, there's science out there that suggests that if you clear more than 20% of the forest, that mechanism will fail. Okay, a failed rain mechanism in a rainforest is obviously a very serious thing. Leads to savannization. So in environmental respects, we can't let that happen. But more importantly, from an economic point of view, is that mechanism also provides somewhere between 30 and 40% of the water that comes into the agriculture that is in the Rio de la Plata Basin, which is one of the great economic agricultural heartlands of the world. Imagine you lose 30 to 40% of rain in a crop-producing region. You don't have a 30 to 40% loss of productivity. You have a catastrophe. And you have the kinds of things that our earlier speaker about security was talking about. Where do people go who can't eat? You don't have a food price shock. You have a food supply shock. That's very different. Who's the #1 buyer of food from that area? China. Is China going to allow itself to starve, or is it going to do something about that? So we have a really big economic interest in thinking through how we connect these dots differently. And the way we've gone about it is to develop an insurance idea. So what if we created an insurance product against the collapse of rainfall in the La Plata Basin? So you could buy insurance against the loss, but part of the premium would also go to preventing the loss. So in other words, you buy true insurance for indemnity, and you also take some of the premium, about half in our model, and invest it in saving the forest. And then you've got a financial mechanism that makes rational sense on income statements for companies to buy, and you achieve an outcome that stabilizes the environmental issue that is the problem. And my point here is that we talk about these things as environmental problems. If we reconceive them as economic problems, we can make an economically rational case for action. So this idea of insuring the Amazon is an effort that we've made to completely turn this problem on its head and say, we cannot afford this. And it's the difference between economics of things and the financialization of things. And one of our great gaps is we've got lots of economics that says we can't afford to lose these things. What we don't have is a lot of financialization of how to do that. So this insurance idea for the Amazon is one mechanism that colleagues and I have developed to say we can actually create something that's rational financially that would actually solve one of the world's biggest problems. We simply cannot afford to lose the Amazon rainforest for good financial and agricultural reasons.
And Harvey, who's buying in? Who's this aimed at?
Well, there's the buyers can be agricultural producers, hydro reservoirs. I just had some modeling done this week. 20% of the water supply for the city of Sao Paulo, which is the industrial heartland of South America, comes directly from the Amazon rainforest. And so if you get into think about that, then all the manufacturers who use water, the city, and then of course buyers, like I noticed some of the sponsors here, are buying products from that area.
Okay.
So they have supply chain risk. And then if you get further back, who owns the shares in all these companies? You have big owners of assets that are carrying this risk that is currently unpriced, currently unindemnified, and currently growing every day, because we're at something like 17% of the Amazon forest is cleared. And there's a threshold around 20 that a lot of people are very worried about. So this is an imminent, pressing risk that affects every large financial house in Europe.
Sure. And as you say, catastrophic consequences. We'll come back to some of those points. I think you really opened up something there, opened up the broader debate. But we'll go first to your colleague, Lauren Phillips, at the end. You're obviously representing or speaking from the point of view of the Food and Agricultural Organization based in Rome, celebrating its 80th anniversary last October. And I suppose its commitment to addressing those global challenges such as food security, agricultural development and poverty have never been more crucial. So we look forward to hearing from you, Lauren, please.
Thank you. As you all know, FAO is not a financing organization, but we are very interested in financing for green transition, but also agri-food systems transition more broadly. And so we participated in the Seville conference last year on financing for development by producing a series of papers where we analyzed some of the constraints that were facing problems and potential solutions for financing agri-food system transformation. And that paper, which was called Financing for the Future of Food, I want to start by saying that to address the environmental and climate challenges in agri-food systems transformation, we really need to look at the interactions that also has with social challenges. 1 billion people in the world work in agri-food systems directly, which means that about half of the world's population depends on agri-food systems for their livelihoods when you include children, spouses, et cetera. And so we're talking about half of the world's population, which is heavily dependent on this system working better, being able to withstand the kinds of climatic shocks and finding the right financing to transform itself appropriately. And so that series of research that we did last year sort of pointed out to 3 types of problems in financing for agri-food systems transformation: a quantity problem, a quality problem, and a targeting problem. I want to give you some examples on each, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the link to climate financing specifically. The quantity problem is the most straightforward. The estimations that we have as FAO is that we need around $680 billion of financing per year to transform agri-food systems. Now, a large part of that financing gap is to pay for social protection, because the system isn't working already. It's not working to meet our social needs and our environmental needs. So if we could get the rest of the investment going, we may actually be able to reduce the cost for transformation, because we could reduce the cost of the insurance, social insurance scheme, social protection costs of transforming the system. So that's the quantity problem. The quality problem is that the money that we do have available is not being used as effectively and efficiently as it could be. We have a problem, for example, with public financing in developing countries not being used, agricultural budgets not being used to achieve the aims that governments themselves set out, right? So we have use for subsidies, for example, which may not be the best use of funding if you have an interest in social protection, poverty reduction, nutrition, and productivity. And then finally, we have a targeting problem. The money that is going to agri-food systems transformation is heavily skewed towards richer countries, which are less dependent on agriculture for their economies, and to richer people within poorer countries. So we have both an in-country and within-country problem of targeting. Now, if I just give you sort of some examples about the issues around climate financing for agri-food systems transformation, the percentage of climate financing in the public sphere, so this is development money, that goes to the part of agricultural public financing, which is climate financed, is declining. It used to be about 50%, now it's about 20%. And it's coming really just from 4 large donors: the European Union, Germany, France, and Japan. And we've already heard earlier today about the kinds of constraints that those donors and others are under to reduce financing further. So we have there a problem of quantity, but we also have that targeting problem in climate financing because only about less than 1% of the climate financing money gets down to the poorest, to the smallholders who are living on the edge of agricultural productivity and suffer massive losses from climate related events. So this is the source of problems we have. We have an opportunity though to improve, I think, the quality of that financing by innovating. Most of you have heard about climate swaps for debt for climate swaps, debt for environment swaps, swaps on food security. I think there's a lot of opportunities to do more. And I think that we're really open to having conversations about the kinds of instruments that we could be using, innovative insurance mechanisms, protecting against crop losses and other kinds of agricultural crises, looking at the ways that the system could use innovative financing that Harvey was speaking about, or new types of bonds or debt instruments. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Just very quickly, you said at the outset, obviously, that the Food and Agriculture Organization, it isn't a financing body, very clear indeed. But as a multilateral forum, it's very well placed, I suppose, to mobilize that potential, whether it comes to research and development, whether it comes to digitization, etc. How do you see the FAO's role, I suppose, changing in the new environment? And is it agile enough? That whole question of agility that we spoke about earlier, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the European Commission, what about the FAO as a UN body? How agile is it to deal with the sort of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to this bigger picture of the green transition,
most people wouldn't claim that a bureaucracy is agile, right? There's lots of people who represent bureaucracies probably in the room. But I think one advantage that the FAO has is that we are using systems approaches and system thinking because we're thinking about agri-food systems as interconnected systems that already places us in sort of in good stead for such a complex system. And so I think that our role is to provide data and evidence for sure about the gaps and the potential solutions, but also to convene different actors because we can be a sort of a neutral convening space to have conversations about these very crucial issues of financing agri-food systems.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much indeed. Very much a systems-based approach. Kurt, I'll come back to this end of the panel. You heard there now some pretty innovative financing solutions, some creative ideas coming from the Harvey Locks of this world and his experience, as I say, from Western Canada and his experience on the ground in Latin America. We spoke earlier again about the constraints, the budgetary constraints we find ourselves in. You spoke about the proposal on the multi-annual financial framework, this overhauled budget that we're now dealing with. To what extent is it possible for the European Commission, DG Klima, your own Directorate General, to engage with those sort of private initiatives, to engage in a public-private partnership, to get this thing moving, to accelerate it on the ground, and to really drive the thing forward in a very new geopolitical landscape that we find ourselves in with those budgetary constraints that we keep mentioning?
Well, engaging with the private sector and forming partnerships is exactly what we want to do, because if we all wait for the European budgets to solve everything, then we'll wait a long time. The budget can play a role, shall play a role, but it is only a catalyzing role. What I hear as a common thread from all the speakers is the power of land, the power of pricing, the power of data and digital, and the power of actors. If we combine all that, the power of land, knowing that the land is fundamental for food production, but much more than that. It's also a source of biomass, of biogenic carbon that we will need if we want to phase out fossil carbon, for example. But it's also a source of climate stability. If we want to keep our planet livable over time, we'll need carbon removals, also from land. Secondly, the power of pricing. It was said by Martin and others. We really need to price the risks, but also the rewards, and reward the resilience that land can bring. That requires data and digital. I will not further expand on this, but then there's also the power of the actors all coming together to really work on that. That requires some institutional frameworks that ensure the trust and the integrity. That is what we want to offer with the CRCF, Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Regulation, which is not the solution to everything, but it can be a catalyst to bring all these powers together and develop a kind of virtuous loop in which then the financing almost comes naturally because it's in the economic interest of all the actors involved. And this has to be, as Harvey was saying, connecting the dots and the actors. This is not one sector, one actor that can do it. It really has to be in a framework that brings everyone together.
Joint up thinking, a joint up approach. Is your Directorate General cooking up something on land use? Did I hear something about a land use strategy that's in the offing, or is that am I running up the wrong garden path here?
We are working as part of the bioeconomy strategy on making sure that we take the most out of this CRCF regulation. We are not working as such on a land use strategy unless my colleagues are involved in something that I'm not aware of.
Okay, well, if you're the big cheese, the boss, Kurt, that would surprise me greatly. Harvey, some creative thinking. You spoke about the nature positive goal by 2030. 2030, or at least last night you did. 2030 is just around the corner. I wanted to talk about progress towards that goal, and I wanted to talk about measuring it, and again, how you get the buy-in and yes, get it off the ground. But I mean, we're approaching 2030 at top speed at the moment.
Yeah, so the nature positive goal was developed by a number of us in anticipation of the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations in Montreal. And the goal is to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030 from a 2020 baseline. Why? Because nature is essential to the functioning of the planet, and it's not going well. We need to make it go well. So that's the nature positive goal in a nutshell. How are we measuring progress against it? Well, we had a speaker from Mongolia talking about we have the 30 by 30 goal, which comes out of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and trying to work towards that. And I was really impressed when she said, it works best if you work from the goal you want and work backwards to the systems you need. And I think this is our challenge, is that we're making progress conceptually. Similarly with the climate, if we met every climate goal that we had, we'd be looking really good. It's not that we don't have good goals, it's that we're not getting there fast enough. And if we don't get there fast enough, everything goes badly for everyone. It doesn't go bad for the environmental sector, it goes bad for the whole world. It goes bad for the economy, it goes bad for agriculture, it goes bad for everything. So we're all in this together. And so how we measure that will, of course, depend on sector. On Thursday, I and a team of global co-authors published an article in Frontiers in Science called Nature Positive, Halting and Reversing Biodiversity Loss Towards Stabilizing the Earth System. I think some of you might know.
A snappy title there, Harvey.
Snappy title, yeah. Well, somebody mentioned planetary boundaries. It's all about that. One of the co-authors is Johan Rockström, who I think some of you will know. And there are a bunch of metrics in there about how you might measure it. But the biggest thing is, if we want a world that we want, instead of a world that we're on track to have, we have to make a conscious decision to go somewhere. And then we have to figure out how we align the interests in some new way to get there. Mm-hmm. And one thing I can tell you for sure is 40 years of having been an environmental activist, if you're counting on the environmental community to protect the environmental interest of everybody, you're backing a losing horse. This is about everybody. It's not about the environmental community. This is about the context for all life on Earth, for all human activity. And we really need to understand that the model of sustainable development of 3 concentric rings, where you have economy, environment, society, and they're all in competition, and you're looking for this little sweet spot in the middle, is dead wrong. The way the world works is, here's the environment, nature, climate, everything. That's been evolving for 4 billion years. Didn't used to have humans on it until 250,000 years ago. Inside that is human society, which has existed for 250,000 years and is wholly and completely dependent on this bigger context. And inside that is the economy, which is only there for one purpose, to serve people. And we have to get our conceptual framework right, and then do this reconnection of the dots in ways that are rational for everyone.
Mm-hmm. That's quite a statement there, Harvey. I'm going to throw it out to the floor and see if there's a reaction. Would anybody like to comment? Would anybody like to ask a question? We're kind of heading towards lunchtime. Right, gentlemen, right in the front there. If I could get a microphone to it. Right there, second row. Please introduce yourself and say to whom the question is addressed.
Hello, my name is Algis Gaišutis. I'm a forest and landowner from Lithuania. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. It is wise statements and it is very interesting to listen. But I was surprised that no one even mentioned nature restoration law, which was so politically tricky. Previous good commission, but now we have a period of implementation and member states, and we are working on developing a national implementation plan, nature restoration plan. Commission said, guided by Timmermans, that it is not sufficient to have nature laws, directives, and we need something stricter in addition, but it will be financed additionally. And somehow Commission is shy to say how much it costs and from where the financing will come. So we're afraid that it will be some new restrictions on, and it will be on shoulder of forest owners, farmers, and the forest owners. But maybe you can comment, maybe you have a good message here, how it could be finance and accelerate transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Kurt, I turn to you as the European Commission representative. The nature restoration law.
Well, the nature restoration law is there, COTANC, and we need to implement it in the best, most cost-efficient manner possible. I think what we see is a big value in the bioeconomy, and what we need to find is models that really mobilize finance, because it's not only there for environmental protection, but also it brings economic value. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with models like, for example, the CRCF, but also linking to other policy files that we have, like climate adaptation, for example, where we can show that more nature and better protected nature is also helping to protect ourselves against the growing risks of climate change.
Okay, thank you for that. I might turn to Martin and Michael, coming from, I suppose, outside of the Brussels bubble, outside of this sort of the European Commission regulatory framework. What are you looking, when you look to the policy makers, what are you looking for to make your investments work on the ground and to sort of make them more attractive, etc.? What do you need? What sort of obstacles are there, and what do you need that would sort of alleviate those investment opportunities? Briefly, the two of you, if you don't mind.
I mean, the first thing I'd really like to say, within all the malaise that we have currently politically inherited and that we are in the middle of, and with all the limitations that we also might feel as European Commission and as lawmakers, I think fundamentally this room has something hot to offer. We live in a world where we, both politically and economically, and I said that before, are increasingly aware of all these unpriced risks, and there is a premium on resilience, and this community is a very potent supplier of these resilient infrastructure services. So that actually strengthens the position of those who are pursuing this agenda. And increasingly, this starts to get materially relevant for political, but also for economic decisions. And increasingly also, as I said before, we are able to show that these resilient services are real technology, and some standards, nature positive initiative, etc., are helping us on that. So it's our job as a community to show that you can build up nature, you can build up soils, you can measure what that does to the economy, you can make that contractable and transferable as an immaterial right. Once we have been able to demonstrate that, we would give confidence to the rule makers that this is in fact something that you can play with. So we can move on to those who, for example, are sitting on all of these risks that we talk about in central banks, or those who are governing through prudential rulemaking the banks, and who actually need to find ways to get out of a world that gets increasingly structurally uninsurable, unbankable, unfundable, uninvestable. And so once they see that this line of custody can be created, that sort of 1 unit of nature improved, 1 hectare safeguarded, is in fact a way to take risk out of our public balance sheets, take risk out of our central bank balance sheets. Then they can very easily set incentives with instrumentarium that is well established and that we use everywhere else, but for something as important as the preservation of nature.
And as you say, putting nature back on the balance sheet. Michael, I turn to you from the Munich Re. Do you have something to add on the basis of what you've heard thus far?
Yep, I think like what would be important is that we are starting to create a common baseline about what we are thinking and what the situation actually is. And I think policy made a great job in showcasing or making obvious to the larger public the pricing of climate risks, for example, through now European banks and others in the world having to show on their balance sheets what actually climate risks they own. And I think this is a very good first step. But we need to take this further. We need to take this more into mainstream to really enable all of us to have this common baseline, to really look at the same thing. Looking at the same thing would also like require then further help with aligning models. Like we are coming from, like my parent company is a quite large reinsurer, so we have a lot of data, we have a lot of models, but this doesn't necessarily mean that like this is sufficient. Like we need more, we need a better approach, and we need also an approach which is shared then by the larger community. And that will at the end of the day help not only like to make investments better, but also to help like everyone who wants to improve nature, who wants to have positive outcome, to really get a price for this. And in a price, I don't mean a cost, but I mean an improvement of an asset. I mean an improvement of a balance sheet, and not like just kind of having this as a sunk cost or having this as a philanthropic exercise. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Michael. I'm going to turn, just last word, and we will break for lunch then, but I said at the top of the session that there will be a change in the FAO leadership in the summer of 2027. And last night, Lauren, you spoke very passionately about rethinking how the system works, being imaginative, being bold. What would be your key piece of advice to the future FAO Director General when it comes to this very important topic of financing and accelerating the transition on the ground? What would be your message?
Oh, you're really putting me in the hot seat. Well, first to say that there is no vacancy. You mentioned at the start there's a vacancy. There's not a vacancy yet. There's a lot of discussion.
Okay,
as anybody who's reading Politico is
we've
aware.
got our eye on a number of potential candidates, let's say. But
Keep your eye out for the end of the year for vacancy.
But the advice for the future, the next Director General, let's say, Lauren.
Yeah, I think that the advice goes to something that you were saying in your previous question to me about multilateralism and about agility. I mean, multilateralism, obviously not a perfect system, but much better than the alternatives in the sense that it's good to gather everybody together. And by everybody, I mean all member states, but I also mean, of course, civil society, private sector, all actors, because agri-food systems are such a large part of the economy and environmental solutions, as we were discussing. And so keeping at the center the fact that slower processes, which are negotiated and which have consensus, can sometimes be more durable solutions, even if they seem frustratingly unagile at the time sometimes. So I think it's a very large task to manage an organization which is thinking very deeply about a lot of the issues that people have raised here today, including the planetary boundaries that we were discussing. And to make all of the unaligned interests come together to find some degree of consensus. Leadership can push for a vision where those consensus-based outcomes are more ambitious, and that would be, I think, the message that we need. We don't have to change the way that decisions are taken. We still want to have consensus and multilateralism, but we can push towards objectives which are a bit more ambitious through this process.
A bit more ambitious. We'll leave it on that positive note. So my thanks indeed to my speakers. We're going to wrap it up there. We'll go for lunch. So my thanks once again to Mr. Kurt van den Berge, Martin Stucktai, Michael Brüchner, Harvey Locke, and lastly, Lauren Phillips.